The morning sun cast long shadows across the busy London street as thousands of people hurried past, each lost in their own world. Nobody expected that in the next few minutes, they would witness something that would restore their faith in humanity and remind them that heroes walk among us every single day. Sometimes the most extraordinary moments happen in the most ordinary places. Sometimes courage doesn't wear a uniform or carry a weapon. Sometimes it comes from the most unexpected source, wearing the simplest clothes, speaking the quietest words. And sometimes, just sometimes, the universe aligns perfectly to show us that respect, honor, and dignity are not just words in a dictionary. They're living, breathing principles that good people will defend, no matter the cost. What happened next on that seemingly normal Tuesday morning would be captured on dozens of phones, shared millions of times across social media, and become a story that people would tell their children and grandchildren. It was a moment that proved that in a world full of indifference, there are still those who will stand up for what's right, even when nobody is watching, even when they have nothing to gain, and even when it means putting themselves at risk. This is the story of how one man's cruelty met another man's courage, and how a simple act of respect echoed around the world. Harold Thompson adjusted his worn leather jacket and checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. At 72 years old, he had developed the habit of being exactly on time for everything, a discipline carved into his bones during his 25 years of service in the British Army. The morning air carried a crisp bite that reminded him of those early days at the barracks, when life was simpler and every day had a clear purpose. He stood outside the Department of Veterans Affairs building, clutching a manila envelope that contained his latest medical documents. Inside those papers were the results of tests he had been dreading, confirmation of what he already suspected about his declining health. The shrapnel from a roadside bomb in Northern Ireland had finally shifted, pressing against nerves in ways that made simple tasks increasingly difficult. Harold had served his country with distinction, earning medals that now sat in a small box in his modest flat. He had been wounded twice, survived 3 tours in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, and had saved lives he could no longer count. But none of that seemed to matter now as he faced a bureaucratic system that treated veterans like numbers on a form rather than human beings who had sacrificed their youth, their health, and sometimes their peace of mind for their country. The appointment he was heading to would determine whether he qualified for increased disability benefits. At his age, with his limited savings and mounting medical bills, it was not just about money. It was about dignity, about being able to afford his medications, about not having to choose between heating his flat and buying groceries. As he walked toward the entrance, Harold noticed how people hurried past him without making eye contact. In his younger days, he might have walked with the confident stride of a soldier, his back straight and his head held high. Now, chronic pain had given him a slight shuffle, and the weight of years had bent his shoulders forward. To most passers-by, he looked like just another elderly man struggling with the challenges of aging. But Harold Thompson was far from ordinary. Behind his weathered face were memories of courage under fire, of making split-second decisions that saved lives, of carrying wounded comrades to safety while bullets flew overhead. He had been decorated for valor, promoted for leadership, and respected by men half his age who looked up to him as a father figure. Those days felt like a lifetime ago as he entered the sterile government building. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, unflattering glow. The waiting room was filled with other veterans, some missing limbs, others bearing invisible scars that were just as real. They sat in uncomfortable plastic chairs, filling out forms, and waiting for their turn to explain why they deserved help from the country they had served. Harold took his place among them, pulling out reading glasses that he had only recently admitted he needed. The forms were complicated, filled with medical terminology and legal language that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. He worked slowly and carefully, his handwriting shaky but determined. During his service, Harold had been known for his ability to stay calm under pressure. While other soldiers panicked during enemy attacks, he would assess the situation, make quick decisions, and lead his men to safety. That same composure served him well now as he navigated the frustrating maze of veteran services. The first appointment went better than expected. The caseworker, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Patterson, actually seemed to listen to his concerns. She reviewed his medical records, asked thoughtful questions about his daily challenges, and promised to expedite his application. For the first time in months, Harold allowed himself to feel hopeful. As he left the building, the manila envelope, now containing copies of additional forms and a scheduled follow-up appointment, Harold decided to treat himself to lunch at a small cafe he had noticed on the way in. It was the kind of simple pleasure that his limited budget rarely allowed, but today felt like a day worth celebrating. The cafe was busy with the lunch crowd, filled with office workers grabbing quick meals and construction workers taking a break from a nearby job site. Harold found a small table near the window where he could watch the street while he ate. He ordered fish and chips, a comfort food that reminded him of better days, and settled in to enjoy his meal. At the next table sat a group of young men in expensive suits, their conversation loud and filled with complaints about their high-paying jobs, their demanding bosses, and their weekend plans. Harold couldn't help but overhear their discussion about a vacation to the Mediterranean, casually mentioning amounts of money that represented more than his monthly pension. One of the young men, noticing Harold's attention, made a snide comment to his friends about the old codger eavesdropping on their conversation. His voice was intentionally loud, meant to embarrass and intimidate. Harold simply smiled politely and returned to his meal, having learned long ago that some people's rudeness said more about them than it did about their targets. As Harold finished his lunch and prepared to leave, he carefully counted out the exact change from his wallet, making sure to leave a modest tip for the waitress who had been kind to him. The young man at the next table watched this process with obvious disdain, whispering something to his friends that made them laugh. Harold gathered his things and stood to leave, his movements slower than they once were, but still carrying the dignity of a man who had earned his place in the world through service and sacrifice. He nodded politely to the waitress, thanked her for the meal, and headed toward the door. What Harold didn't know was that his quiet dignity and humble demeanor had caught the attention of someone else in the cafe, someone who would soon play a crucial role in the events that were about to unfold. As he stepped out into the afternoon sun, Harold Thompson had no idea that his ordinary day was about to become anything but ordinary. The street was busier now, filled with afternoon commuters and shoppers. Harold paused for a moment to get his bearings, checking his watch and calculating how long it would take to walk to the bus stop. His next appointment wasn't until tomorrow, which meant he could take his time getting home and perhaps stop by the library to read the newspapers he could no longer afford to buy. As he began walking down the sidewalk, Harold's mind wandered to memories of his late wife, Margaret, who had passed away 3 years earlier. She had been his anchor through all the difficult transitions from military to civilian life, helping him navigate the challenges of readjusting to a world that often seemed indifferent to the sacrifices of its veterans. Margaret would have been proud of how he handled today's appointment, how he maintained his composure and treated everyone with respect even when the system seemed designed to wear him down. She had always said that a person's true character was revealed not in moments of triumph, but in how they handled life's smaller indignities and disappointments. Harold was so lost in these thoughts that he almost didn't notice the commotion developing behind him. The same group of young men from the cafe had finished their lunch and were now walking in the same direction, their conversation having shifted from complaints about work to crude jokes and increasingly aggressive behavior toward other pedestrians. The leader of the group, the one who had made the comment about Harold being an old codger, was clearly enjoying his role as the center of attention. His name was Bradley Whitmore, the son of a wealthy businessman who had never faced real consequences for his actions. At 28 years old, he had coasted through life on his father's money and connections, developing a sense of entitlement that made him believe he was superior to anyone who didn't share his privileged background. Bradley's friends eager to please and afraid of being excluded from his social circle, laughed at his jokes, and encouraged his behavior even when they privately felt uncomfortable with it. They were the kind of people who would never stand up to a bully, but were happy to watch from the sidelines as someone else became a target. As the group caught up to Harold, Bradley's attention was drawn to the elderly veteran's humble appearance, his secondhand clothes, his careful way of walking, and the manila envelope that marked him as someone dealing with government bureaucracy. In Bradley's privileged worldview, these were signs of failure, of someone who hadn't worked hard enough or made smart enough choices to achieve success. What Bradley couldn't see and wouldn't have understood even if he could were the real signs that marked Harold as a man of substance. The way he held himself with quiet dignity despite his physical limitations, the respectful way he interacted with everyone he met, and the inner strength that came from a lifetime of putting others before himself. The collision between these two worlds, one built on entitlement and the other forged in service, was about to create a moment that would reveal the true character of both men and set in motion events that neither could have predicted. The confrontation began with something as simple as a dropped envelope. As Harold Thompson walked slowly down the busy sidewalk, a sudden gust of wind caught the manila envelope containing his Veteran Affairs documents. The papers scattered across the pavement, and Harold, moving as quickly as his aged body would allow, began gathering them up. Bradley Whitmore and his group were walking directly behind Harold when this happened. Instead of offering help or simply walking around the elderly man, Bradley saw an opportunity for entertainment. He deliberately stepped on one of the documents as Harold reached for it, grinding his expensive shoe against the paper. "Watch where you're going, old man," Bradley said loudly, his voice carrying the entitled tone of someone who had never been challenged. His friends snickered behind him, encouraging the behavior with their silence and smirks. Harold looked up from his position on the ground, his weathered hands still gathering the scattered papers. For a moment, their eyes met, and Harold saw something that made him deeply sad. Not anger, which he could understand, but a complete lack of empathy. This young man genuinely believed that Harold's age and apparent poverty made him less worthy of basic human respect. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience," Harold said quietly, his voice steady despite the pain shooting through his knees as he knelt on the concrete. "The wind caught my papers." Bradley's response revealed the depth of his character, or lack thereof. Instead of accepting the polite apology or simply moving on, he doubled down on his aggression. He looked around to make sure he had an audience, that people were watching his display of dominance over someone he perceived as weak and defenseless. "Maybe if you weren't so old and pathetic, you could hold on to your welfare paperwork," Bradley said, his voice dripping with contempt. "People like you are what's wrong with this country, always looking for handouts instead of taking care of yourselves." The words hit Harold like physical blows, not because they hurt his feelings, but because they revealed such a fundamental misunderstanding of service and sacrifice. This young man, who had clearly been given everything in life without earning any of it, was lecturing a decorated veteran about taking responsibility. Harold slowly stood up, his movements careful and deliberate. At his full height, even bent slightly with age, he still cut an imposing figure. There was something in his posture that spoke of military training, of a man who had faced much worse than verbal abuse and emerged stronger for it. "These aren't welfare papers, son," Harold said, his voice still calm, but carrying a subtle authority that made several passers-by slow down to watch. "They're medical documents from Veterans Affairs. I served my country for 25 years. Bradley's response showed that either he didn't understand the significance of what Harold had just said, or he simply didn't care. His privileged upbringing had taught him that his wealth and status made him superior to everyone else, regardless of their service or sacrifice. "So what?" Bradley sneered. "That doesn't give you the right to block the sidewalk with your junk. Some of us have important places to be and important work to do. We're not all living off government handouts." The crowd that had been forming around them grew larger as Bradley's voice rose. Office workers stopped to watch, construction crews paused their lunch breaks, and shoppers slowed their pace. What they were witnessing was more than just a verbal altercation. It was a clash between two completely different value systems. Harold could have walked away. His military training had taught him to choose his battles wisely, and at 72 years old, he had nothing to prove to anyone. But something in Bradley's complete dismissal of his service, his reduction of a decorated veteran to a welfare case, triggered a response that had nothing to do with personal pride and everything to do with principle. "Young man," Harold said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded troops in combat, "you clearly don't understand what military service means. These documents represent medical care I've earned through 25 years of protecting people like you, including 3 tours in combat zones where better men than you died defending the freedoms you take for granted." The crowd was completely silent now, sensing that they were witnessing something significant. Bradley's friends looked uncomfortable, finally beginning to realize that their leader had picked the wrong target. But Bradley himself was too committed to his performance to back down. "Oh, spare me the sob story," Bradley said, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. "I'm tired of you old soldiers acting like the world owes you something. Maybe if you'd been smart enough to get a real job instead of playing soldier, you wouldn't be begging for scraps now." The insult to his fallen comrades was the final straw for Harold. Every veteran knows the weight of survivor's guilt, the burden of coming home when good friends didn't. To have those sacrifices dismissed by someone who had never risked anything for anyone else was intolerable. Harold stepped closer to Bradley, and despite his age and physical limitations, there was something in his movement that made the younger man unconsciously step back. The veteran's voice dropped to a quiet intensity that was somehow more intimidating than shouting. "Son, you have no idea what you're talking about. While you were probably learning how to spend daddy's money, I was pulling wounded soldiers out of burning vehicles. While you were complaining about your trust fund, I was making decisions that kept good men alive. You want to talk about earning things? I've earned every dollar of my military pension with blood, sweat, and sleepless nights wondering if I'd made the right choices to bring my boys home safe." Bradley's response showed that he was either incapable of understanding the magnitude of his mistake or simply didn't care. Instead of recognizing that he had insulted a true hero, he escalated the confrontation in a way that would have consequences he couldn't imagine. "Listen, you pathetic old fool," Bradley snarled, pushing Harold hard in the chest and causing him to stumble backward. "I don't care what you did 50 years ago. Right now, you're just another worthless old man taking up space and wasting my time." The physical assault changed everything. What had been a verbal confrontation was now something much more serious. Harold caught himself against a lamppost, his face showing pain not just from the push but from the arthritis and old injuries that made such sudden movements agony. The crowd gasped collectively. Phones came out to record what was happening, and several people stepped forward as if to intervene. But before anyone could act, Harold straightened up, looked Bradley directly in the eyes, and said something that would haunt the younger man for years to come. "I feel sorry for you, son. Not because of what you just did to me, but because you're going to have to live the rest of your life knowing what kind of person you really are. And I suspect that deep down, you already know that who you are right now is not someone worth being." Bradley's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. Being lectured about character by someone he considered beneath him was intolerable. The fact that Harold maintained his dignity even after being assaulted made Bradley feel small in a way he had never experienced. What happened next would be captured on multiple phones, shared across social media platforms, and become a defining moment for everyone involved. But in that instant, as Bradley raised his hand to strike an elderly veteran who had dedicated his life to serving others, none of them knew that someone in the crowd was about to intervene in a way that would change everything. The tension in the air was palpable as the crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see if this entitled young man would actually strike a vulnerable elderly veteran. Some people were already calling the police, others were recording everything, and a few were preparing to physically intervene if necessary. Harold stood his ground, not out of stubbornness, but out of principle. He had faced enemy fire without backing down, and he wasn't about to let a spoiled bully intimidate him now. Whatever happened next, he would face it with the same courage that had earned him his decorations and the respect of every soldier who had ever served under his command. Bradley's hand was raised, his face twisted with rage. The crowd was watching in horror, and the moment seemed suspended in time. Then, from the edge of the crowd, came a voice that would change everything, a voice carrying an authority that even Bradley Whitmore couldn't ignore. "That will be quite enough." The voice cut through the tension like a sword through silk, carrying an authority that made everyone in the crowd instinctively turn toward its source. Standing at the edge of the gathering was a man in his early 30s, wearing a simple black suit that looked unremarkable except for its perfect fit and the way he carried himself within it. Sergeant Major James Pemberton of Her Majesty's Royal Guard was not in uniform, having just finished a security briefing at a nearby government building. To most observers, he appeared to be just another civil servant or businessman, but his posture, the way he moved through the crowd, and the quiet confidence in his voice marked him as someone accustomed to command. Bradley turned toward the new voice with irritation, his hand still raised as if to strike Harold. "Mind your own business," he snapped. "This doesn't concern you." James stepped closer, and those with military experience in the crowd immediately recognized something familiar in his bearing. He moved with the controlled precision of someone who had spent years in elite military training, every gesture economical and purposeful. "Actually, it does concern me," James said quietly, his voice carrying easily despite its low volume. "When I see someone threatening a veteran, it becomes very much my business." Bradley looked James up and down dismissively, seeing only a man in a business suit who appeared to be interfering in something that didn't involve him. The entitled young man was so accustomed to people backing down from his aggression that he couldn't conceive of someone who might not be intimidated by his wealth or connections. "Look, whoever you are," Bradley said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This old man was blocking the sidewalk with his garbage, and I'm teaching him some manners. Why don't you run along before I decide to include you in the lesson?" James smiled then, but it wasn't a friendly expression. It was the kind of smile that soldiers learned to recognize as a warning, the calm before a storm that could destroy everything in its path. He took another step forward, closing the distance between himself and Bradley to just a few feet. "I'm Sergeant Major James Pemberton, Her Majesty's Royal Guard," he said, his voice still quiet but now carrying unmistakable steel. "And you've just threatened to assault a British military veteran in my presence. I strongly suggest you reconsider your next action." The change in the crowd was immediate and electric. Phones that had been recording turned to capture better angles. People pressed closer to witness what was clearly becoming a significant confrontation. And those who understood the implications of James's introduction began to whisper excitedly to those around them. Bradley, however, seemed oblivious to the gravity of his situation. His privileged upbringing had shielded him from any real understanding of military hierarchy or the respect commanded by elite units like the Royal Guard. To him, this was just another person trying to interfere with his dominance over someone he considered inferior. "Royal Guard," Bradley laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it now. "What is this, some kind of costume party? I don't care if you're the Queen's own bodyguard. This is between me and the old man." James looked past Bradley to Harold, who was still standing with quiet dignity despite the pain and humiliation he had endured. The veteran's posture, the way he held himself despite his age and injuries, told James everything he needed to know about the man's character and service record. "Sir," James said, addressing Harold directly with the respect due to a fellow veteran, "are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Harold straightened slightly, recognizing both the military courtesy and the genuine concern in the younger man's voice. "I'm fine, son. Thank you for asking. Just dealing with someone who doesn't understand what service means." The exchange between the two veterans, conducted with mutual respect and understanding, highlighted the vast difference between their worldview and Bradley's. While Harold and James recognized in each other the bonds forged by military service, Bradley saw only obstacles to his entitled behavior. "Oh, this is rich," Bradley said, his voice rising with frustration. "Now we got two military heroes ganging up on me. What's next? Are you going to tell me about how you both fought in wars to keep me free?" James turned back to Bradley, and his expression had grown colder. "Actually, yes. That's exactly what we did. And unlike you, we understand that freedom comes with responsibility, including the responsibility to treat others with basic human decency." "I don't need lectures from government employees," Bradley shot back, his anger overriding what little good sense he possessed. "I pay more in taxes in 1 year than you probably make in 5. You work for me, not the other way around." The crowd around them had grown significantly, with people stopping to watch what was clearly becoming a confrontation between two very different types of men. Office workers, students, tourists, and local residents all found themselves drawn to witness this clash between entitlement and service. James shook his head slowly, almost sadly. "You really don't understand, do you? You think your money makes you superior to men who've dedicated their lives to serving something greater than themselves. You think your wealth entitles you to treat a decorated veteran like garbage." "That's exactly what I think," Bradley said, emboldened by what he mistook as a victory. "Money is what matters in the real world, not playing dress-up and marching around for the Queen. This old man is a burden on society, and people like me are the ones who have to pay for his medical care and housing." Harold spoke up then, his voice still calm despite the insults. "Son, I've been paying taxes since before you were born. My military pension isn't charity. It's deferred compensation that I earned through 25 years of service. And the medical care I receive is treatment for injuries sustained while defending this country." Bradley turned back to Harold with renewed aggression. "I don't care what you think you earned, old man. You're still in my way, and you're still wasting my time." What happened next shocked everyone, including the police officers who were just arriving in response to multiple 911 calls. Bradley, frustrated by his inability to intimidate either veteran and feeling cornered by the growing crowd, decided to escalate the situation beyond anything anyone could have predicted. He reached out and grabbed the manila envelope from Harold's hands, the one containing the veteran's medical documents and appointment information. With a sneer of disgust, Bradley tore the envelope in half and threw the papers to the ground, scattering Harold's important documents across the dirty sidewalk once again. "There," Bradley said with satisfaction. "Now, maybe you'll learn to stay out of the way of your betters." The destruction of the veteran's papers created a moment of stunned silence. Even Bradley's friends, who had been reluctantly supporting his behavior, looked shocked at this latest escalation. The crowd pressed closer, their earlier curiosity now replaced by genuine anger at what they had witnessed. Harold looked down at his scattered papers, documents that represented months of bureaucratic work, medical appointments he couldn't afford to miss, and evidence of his service that he needed to maintain his benefits. His hand shook slightly as he knelt once again to gather them up, some now torn and dirty beyond easy repair. James watched Harold struggle to collect his damaged papers, and something fundamental shifted in his demeanor. The professional control that marked his military bearing gave way to something much more personal. Righteous anger on behalf of a fellow veteran who had been treated with unconscionable disrespect. "You made a very serious mistake," James said to Bradley, his voice now carrying the full authority of his position and training. "Destroying a veteran's official documents is a criminal offense. Assaulting an elderly person is a criminal offense. And threatening a military veteran while he's conducting official business is something that I take very personally." Bradley, still riding the high of his destructive act, made the fatal error of believing that his family's wealth and connections could protect him from any consequences. "Do your worst, toy soldier. My father owns half the politicians in this city, and his lawyers will have you cleaning toilets before this is over." James smiled again, but this time it was genuinely amused. Your father's lawyers are welcome to try. But first, you're going to pick up every single piece of paper you just destroyed. You're going to apologize to this veteran for your despicable behavior. And then you're going to wait right here for the police to arrive so we can discuss the charges that will be filed against you. I'm not doing anything for you or that pathetic old man, Bradley declared, his voice loud enough to be heard by everyone in the growing crowd. And I'm certainly not waiting around for any police. Do you have any idea who my family is? James looked around at the crowd that had gathered, noting the dozens of phones recording the confrontation, the angry faces of people who had witnessed Bradley's behavior, and the police officers who were now making their way through the crowd toward them. Actually, James said with quiet satisfaction, I don't think your family connections are going to help you with what's about to happen next. The arrival of the Metropolitan Police transformed the dynamic of the confrontation entirely. Two officers, Constable Sarah Mitchell and Sergeant David Reynolds, approached the scene with the professional caution that comes from years of experience with public disturbances. What they found was far more complex than a simple street argument. Sergeant Reynolds, a 20-year veteran of the force, immediately recognized the signs of a situation that had escalated beyond normal boundaries. The crowd was unusually large and engaged. Multiple people were recording the events, and there was a tension in the air that suggested something significant had occurred. Right then, Sergeant Reynolds said in a voice trained to cut through chaos, "What's all this about?" Before anyone else could speak, Bradley stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. His family's wealth and connections had always provided a buffer between him and the legal system, and he expected the same protection now. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," Bradley said, his tone suddenly reasonable and concerned. "These men have been harassing me and blocking the sidewalk. I was simply trying to get to an important business meeting when this old man deliberately got in my way, and then his friend here started threatening me." The simplicity and audacity of the lie left several witnesses speechless. Bradley was attempting to completely reverse the roles, casting himself as the victim and the two veterans as the aggressors. It was a strategy that might have worked if there hadn't been dozens of people with cameras recording the entire confrontation. Constable Mitchell looked around at the crowd, noting their expressions of disbelief and anger at Bradley's version of events. Her police training had taught her to be suspicious when a suspect's account didn't match the body language and reactions of the witnesses. "Is that what happened?" she asked the crowd generally, and immediately several voices called out in contradiction. "That's not true at all," shouted a woman who had been recording from the beginning. "That young man assaulted the elderly gentleman and destroyed his papers. I saw the whole thing," called out a construction worker who had been on his lunch break. "The old fellow was just trying to pick up his papers when this bully started pushing him around." James stepped forward and presented his credentials to Sergeant Reynolds. "Sergeant Major James Pemberton, Her Majesty's Royal Guard. I witnessed this gentleman," he indicated Bradley, "physically assault Mr. Thompson here, a military veteran, and then destroy his official Veterans Affairs documents." The presentation of military credentials immediately changed the officers' approach to the situation. While they maintained their professional neutrality, both Reynolds and Mitchell understood the credibility that such credentials carried and the seriousness of the allegations being made. Bradley's confidence wavered for the first time as he realized that his simple lie wasn't going to be accepted without question. "That's ridiculous," he protested. "I never touched anyone. These people are obviously making things up to protect each other." "Actually," said Constable Mitchell, looking at her phone, "we've already received several videos of the incident through social media. Would you like to explain why your version of events doesn't match what appears to be clear video evidence of you pushing Mr. Thompson and tearing up his documents?" The mention of video evidence drained the color from Bradley's face. In his arrogance and anger, he had completely forgotten about the ubiquity of smartphone cameras and social media. What had seemed like a private moment of dominance was actually one of the most public acts he had ever committed. Harold, who had been quietly gathering his torn papers with the help of several compassionate strangers, looked up as one of the witnesses handed him pieces of an important medical form. "Officer," he said quietly, "I just want to go home. I don't need any trouble." Sergeant Reynolds knelt down beside Harold, noting the old man's careful movements and the obvious pain he was experiencing. "Sir, you're the victim here. No one's going to be in trouble except the person who caused this situation. Can you tell me what happened?" Harold's account was simple, factual, and delivered without malice or exaggeration. He described going to his Veterans Affairs appointment, having lunch, and then being confronted by Bradley for no apparent reason. He mentioned the verbal abuse, the physical assault, and the destruction of his documents, but he did so in the measured tones of someone who was more disappointed in human nature than angry about his personal treatment. As Harold spoke, James provided additional details as a witness, and several members of the crowd offered to provide their video recordings as evidence. What emerged was a clear picture of unprovoked aggression by Bradley against a vulnerable elderly veteran. Bradley's friends, who had been silent throughout the police questioning, began to distance themselves from their former leader. When asked by Constable Mitchell if they had witnessed the events, they reluctantly confirmed the basic facts of Harold's and James's accounts, unwilling to commit perjury to protect someone whose behavior had finally crossed a line they couldn't ignore. "This is ridiculous," Bradley protested as the weight of evidence mounted against him. "Do you know who my father is? Do you understand what kind of legal trouble you'll be in if you arrest me based on the word of some old man and his military friend?" Sergeant Reynolds had been a police officer long enough to recognize empty threats when he heard them. "Sir, your family connections aren't relevant to the evidence we have. Multiple witnesses, video recordings, and physical evidence all support the allegations against you." The physical evidence Reynolds referred to was Harold's torn documents, which several witnesses had helped collect. The papers clearly showed damage consistent with being deliberately destroyed, and the scattered nature of their distribution supported the accounts of Bradley throwing them to the ground. "I want to call my lawyer," Bradley demanded, finally beginning to understand the seriousness of his situation. "That's your right," Constable Mitchell replied, "but first you're going to be arrested and charged with assault, destruction of property, and disturbing the peace. The lawyer can meet you at the station." As the handcuffs were placed on Bradley's wrists, his demeanor changed completely. The arrogant bully who had terrorized an elderly veteran was replaced by a frightened young man who was finally facing real consequences for his actions. "This isn't over," Bradley called out as he was led to the police car. "My family will make all of you pay for this." James stepped closer to the police car and spoke directly to Bradley through the window. "Your family's money might buy you expensive lawyers, but it can't buy you the respect that you threw away today. Every person here now knows exactly what kind of man you really are." As the police car drove away with Bradley, the crowd began to disperse, but not before many people approached Harold to express their support and admiration for his dignity in the face of such treatment. Several offered to help replace his damaged documents. Others wanted to share their own stories of military family members, and a few simply wanted to shake the hand of a veteran and thank him for his service. Harold was overwhelmed by the kindness and support. In his experience, civilians rarely understood or appreciated military service, and he had grown accustomed to being ignored or dismissed by a society that had moved on for the conflicts he had fought in. The outpouring of respect and gratitude was unexpected and deeply moving. James remained with Harold as the crowd dispersed, helping him organize his rescue documents and offering to accompany him to the Veterans Affairs office to request replacements for those that were beyond repair. The bond between the two veterans was immediate and strong, forged by their shared understanding of service and sacrifice. "You didn't have to get involved," Harold said as they walked slowly toward the bus stop. "You could have just kept walking like everyone else usually does." James shook his head firmly. "No veteran stand alone. Not on my watch. We look after our own, and we don't tolerate disrespect for those who've served." The incident would have far-reaching consequences beyond Bradley's arrest and criminal charges. The videos recorded by witnesses spread rapidly across social media platforms, generating millions of views and sparking conversations about respect for veterans, the consequences of entitled behavior, and the importance of standing up for those who cannot defend themselves. Harold Thompson became an inadvertent symbol of dignity in the face of adversity, while Bradley Whitmore became a cautionary tale about the dangers of privileged arrogance. But, perhaps most importantly, James Pemberton's intervention demonstrated that courage and character still existed in a world that often seemed indifferent to both. As the two veterans waited for Harold's bus, they talked about their experiences, their service, and their hopes for a future where respect and decency would triumph over entitlement and cruelty. They had met as strangers on a busy street, but they parted as brothers in arms, united by their shared commitment to the values they had sworn to defend. The simple act of one person standing up for another had created ripples that would spread far beyond that single afternoon, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways that none of them could have imagined when the day began. 3 months after the confrontation that would change multiple lives forever, Harold Thompson sat in the same cafe where the incident began, but this time he was not alone. Across from him sat James Pemberton, now wearing civilian clothes, but still carrying himself with the bearing of a royal guard. Between them lay several newspapers, each carrying follow-up stories about what the media had dubbed the Royal Guard and the veteran incident. The weeks following Bradley Whitmore's arrest had brought changes that none of them could have predicted. The video footage captured by witnesses had indeed gone viral, but not in the way that typically happens with street confrontations. Instead of becoming mere entertainment, the incident had sparked a genuine conversation about respect, service, and the treatment of veterans in modern society. Harold's phone, which had rarely rung before that day, now buzzed constantly with calls from journalists, veteran organizations, and ordinary citizens who wanted to express their support. The man who had lived in relative anonymity for years suddenly found himself at the center of a movement he never intended to create. "I still can't believe all this fuss," Harold said, gesturing at the newspapers. "I was just trying to gather up my papers and get on with my day." James smiled and took a sip of his tea. That's exactly why it resonated with so many people. You weren't looking for attention or trying to make a statement. You were just being yourself, dignified, respectful, and strong in the face of someone else's ignorance. The transformation in Harold's circumstances had been remarkable. The initial outpouring of support on social media had led to a crowdfunding campaign organized by complete strangers who were moved by his story. The campaign, intended to help him replace his damaged documents and cover any medical expenses, had raised over £50,000 in just 2 weeks. More importantly, the publicity had brought Harold's case to the attention of veteran advocacy groups who had helped him navigate the bureaucratic challenges that had been overwhelming him for months. His medical benefits had been expedited, his disability rating had been properly assessed, and for the first time in years, he had financial security. "The money is wonderful," Harold admitted, "but what means the most is knowing that people still care about service and sacrifice. I was beginning to think the country we defended had forgotten about veterans entirely." The impact on James had been equally significant, though in different ways. His intervention had been captured on video and had brought him to the attention of his superiors in ways that advanced his career and opened doors he hadn't even known existed. But more than that, it had connected him with veteran communities he had never been part of and had shown him the importance of the bonds between all who had served. "I've learned as much from you as you have from this whole experience," James told Harold. "Watching how you handled that situation, the dignity you maintained even when you were being attacked, that's something they can't teach in military training. That comes from character, from a lifetime of choosing to do the right thing." Bradley Whitmore's fate had been very different. Despite his family's wealth and legal connections, the overwhelming evidence against him and the public attention on the case had made any meaningful defense impossible. He had been convicted of assault, destruction of property, and several related charges, resulting in both criminal penalties and a civil judgment that required him to pay for Harold's medical expenses and document replacement. But the legal consequences were minor compared to the social and professional impact. The video of his attack on Harold had been seen by millions of people, and his name had become synonymous with entitled behavior and disrespect for veterans. His father's business had suffered significant backlash, several major contracts had been canceled, and Bradley himself had been forced to resign from his position at the family company. "Have you heard anything about what happened to that young man?" Harold asked, and James was struck once again by the veteran's capacity for concern, even for someone who had treated him so poorly. "Last I heard, he was working in a much smaller company for a fraction of his previous salary," James replied. His father reportedly cut off his trust fund and told him he needed to learn the value of honest work. Harold nodded thoughtfully. "I hope he learns something from all this. He's young enough to change if he wants to. People can become better than they are if they're willing to do the work." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of a young woman with a notebook and a respectful demeanor. "Excuse me, Mr. Thompson. I'm Sarah Chun from the London Herald. I was wondering if I could ask you a few questions about the veteran mentorship program you're starting." Harold looked slightly embarrassed. The mentorship program had been James's idea, a way to channel the public interest in Harold's story into something that could help other veterans facing similar challenges. Harold would work with younger veterans who were struggling with the transition to civilian life, offering guidance based on his own experiences. "It's not really my program," Harold said modestly. "James here is the one doing all the organizing. I'm just sharing what I've learned over the years." Sarah Chun smiled and turned to James. "Sergeant Major Pemberton, the Royal Guard has announced that you're being promoted to a special liaison position working with veteran organizations. How does it feel to know that standing up for Mr. Thompson has led to such significant career advancement?" James looked uncomfortable with the suggestion that his actions had been motivated by career considerations. "The promotion is an honor, but it wasn't why I intervened that day. Any decent person would have done the same thing. You don't let someone attack a veteran without consequences." The interview continued for several more minutes, focusing on the practical aspects of the mentorship program and the broader implications of the incident for veteran support services. But Harold found himself thinking about the deeper questions that the experience had raised. After the reporter left, Harold and James sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the flow of people on the street. The same sidewalk where Harold had been humiliated and attacked now seemed different somehow, infused with the knowledge that good people still existed and would act when action was needed. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Harold said eventually. "That young man who attacked me. He's someone's son. His parents raised him, sent him to good schools, gave him every advantage. How does someone with all those opportunities grow up to treat other people with such contempt?" James considered the question carefully. "I think some people mistake privilege for superiority. They grow up believing that having things means they deserve things, and that people who have less somehow deserve less. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of what makes a person valuable. In the military," Harold reflected, "you learn quickly that a person's worth has nothing to do with where they come from or what their family has. It's about whether they'll stand by you when things get difficult, whether they'll put the mission before themselves, whether they'll help their comrades, even when it costs them something." The mentorship program that grew out of their meeting had already helped dozens of veterans in its first few months. Harold's story had inspired other successful veterans to come forward as mentors, and the program had expanded beyond London to other cities across the United Kingdom. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the countless individuals who had seen the video and been moved to examine their own behavior and attitudes. Schools began using the incident as a case study in respect and bullying prevention. Businesses implemented training programs about treating customers and colleagues with dignity regardless of their apparent circumstances. The viral nature of the video had also brought attention to the broader challenges facing veterans. Government officials who had previously ignored veteran issues found themselves under pressure to address long-standing problems with healthcare, housing, and employment support. Harold's individual struggle had become a symbol of systemic issues that required systemic solutions. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been there that day, Harold mused as they prepared to leave the cafe. Someone else would have stepped up, James said with certainty. That's what I learned from watching the crowd that day. Most people want to do the right thing. They just need someone to take the first step. As they walked together toward the bus stop, Harold carrying himself with the same quiet dignity that had impressed so many viewers of the viral video, both men reflected on how a single moment of courage could ripple outward in ways that changed not just individual lives, but entire communities. The simple act of refusing to let injustice pass unchallenged had created a legacy that would outlast all of them. In a world that often seemed dominated by selfishness and indifference, Harold Thompson and James Pemberton had reminded everyone that character still mattered, that service still deserved respect, and that ordinary people could still choose to be extraordinary when the moment demanded it. Their story became more than just a viral video or a news headline. It became a reminder of the fundamental values that bind civilized society together and the responsibility that each person has to stand up for those values when they are threatened. In the end, it wasn't about a bully and his victim or even about a hero and his intervention. It was about the choice that every person faces every day, whether to turn away from injustice or to take a stand for what is right. Harold Thompson had made that choice simply by maintaining his dignity in the face of cruelty. James Pemberton had made it by refusing to let an elderly veteran face that cruelty alone. And in making those choices, they had shown a watching world what real strength looked like. Not the false power that comes from money or position, but the true power that comes from character, courage, and an unwavering commitment to treating others with the respect that every human being deserves.